Can we talk a little bit about Jackie Kennedy?
Sure.
Uh, where was she born? What was her family like? And how did she meet JFK and all
It's a wonderful story. I'm glad you asked about Jackie because this week's episode about from after Camelot that's coming up is
that?
a chapter just on Jackie. Jackie, it's hard to say. People have asked, was Jack Kennedy capable of loving a woman, like really
Mm,
loving a woman? Because all this has come out about what a womanizer he was. Did he really love Jackie or not? I know he did because of all of the women that had gone through Jack Kennedy's life. I'd say the two great loves of his life were Inga Arvad, who was a beautiful Danish woman who was married, but he had an affair with her during World War II, and I don't think he ever got over her
mm,
until he met Jackie. And Jackie, if there was ever one woman who was a perfect fit for a man like JFK, it was Jackie. They had much in common in their family background. Of course, she was the daughter of Black Jack Bouvier, and Janet Auchincloss, and she came from a privileged, background. She grew up around Newport, Rhode Island, and the wealthy. She was a debutante. She had gone to all the right schools, incredibly intelligent, incredibly cultured and beautiful. She was in that sense a perfect choice for a political wife. But there was so
mm,
much more to her than just that. She was more than just arm candy, more than just beautiful. It was her brain, I think, that Jack was in love with, her mind. She, as brilliant as he was in many ways, she was even smarter. She was fluent in many languages. She knew
yeah, she
arts and
spoke.
culture.
French. I remember.
She did, and Spanish, and she could pretty much pick up any language too very quickly. So she came in
Mm,
handy on his international trips. And because she was so beautiful and charming, she was also a very potent political weapon. And Jack
mm,
used that to his advantage, make no mistake about it, on the campaign trail. She hated campaigning. She hated going out on the road to these campaign events, but ever the dutiful wife, she did. She campaigned with him quite a bit in 1960, and at most of these places, she would get a bigger response from the crowd and more love from the crowd than he did. When he went
mm.
to Paris, famously in 1961, on his way to the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, he said, I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris. And
Yeah.
she was such an important political weapon because she could make any man fall in love with her. I don't think there was ever a man that was immune to her charms. She charmed Charles de Gaulle, who was not an easy man to charm. JFK and de Gaulle always had a rather prickly relationship. And yet, because he brought Jackie along on that trip, it went much smoother. She was there to kind of smooth the way with de Gaulle. Same with Khrushchev. When he met Khrushchev there in Vienna on that trip, that one was a disaster. It didn't go well for Jack. And they walked away from that summit with as he said, it's going to be a very long, cold winter. But Khrushchev was just charmed by Jackie. He loved
Mm,
her. He wasn't so crazy about Jack, but he loved her. And perhaps most importantly, when Jack went on that fateful trip to Texas in November of 63, he specifically asked Jackie to join him on that trip. She didn't usually travel with him, but because there was a lot of division in the Texas Democratic Party, there were these two factions, the rival factions. There was the Governor Connolly faction and the Senator Yarborough faction, the more liberal faction. The party was at war, and he kind of needed her to smooth those ruffled feathers. And also, Jackie was helpful in that even the fancy, rich Republican women there in Dallas kind of liked her because she was so fashionable and beautiful and cultured. They couldn't help but like her. A lot of Jack's enemies adored Jackie. So you can see how that might come in handy, huh?
mm, mm.
So he used that to his advantage, and And that time she was more than willing to join him on the road. She probably later regretted that decision. But, in those interviews I was referencing earlier, the ones that were just released a few years ago that were recorded right after the assassination, she actually said that she was so glad she went to Dallas, despite the horror of sitting inches from her husband's face when he was blown away before her eyes and having his blood and brains battered all over her. And you can only imagine the PTSD that she lived with for the rest of her life. And that's what my podcast episode is about this week, is what happened after Camelot, what happened to Jackie after Camelot. She became addicted to painkillers, alcohol. She was medicating. She was self-medicating just to get through the day. She was having horrible nightmares, seeing the gore of Dallas replay over and over again in her mind. She was under all this pressure to build his presidential library and to get out there and fundraise for the JFK library when she hadn't even finished mourning yet.
But she raised really balanced kids, right?
She did. She did.
What's her name? Caroline Kennedy and JFK Jr.
She once said that her most important job in life was being a mother. She said, if you're not a good mother, I don't think anything else you do in life amounts to much. And she not only said those words, but she lived it. And she put her kids first, the interests of her children. Many people believe that's the real reason she married Aristotle Onassis in 1968. Even though that was a shock to the world, and a lot of people did not like the idea of her marrying this guy, especially the Kennedy family. They all just hated this idea. But she was doing it to protect her kids. After the assassination of Robert Kennedy in 1968, she famously said, if they're killing Kennedys, my kids are targets. And it was just about 3 months later that she married Onassis and moved to his private island, Scorpios, in Greece. And the idea there, of course, was to get her kids out of the country, to keep them safe. And then she moved back to New York in the 70s. Of course, had that beautiful apartment there on Central Park. And she really tried, despite her kids having to be trailed around by Secret Service everywhere they went and being stalked by reporters and photographers and paparazzi. She really, truly tried to give her kids as normal a life as possible. And she also, this is important to point out, she went out of her way to keep Caroline and John as far away from as possible from the Kennedys, most of them. She thought that the Ted Kennedys and the RFKs, specifically Ethel and her brood of 11, were wild troublemakers. And they were. Those kids were always in trouble. She knew that they were doing drugs. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., our HHS secretary, was a 14-year heroin addict, and his addiction and his descent into cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and alcohol addiction, that started when he was 14 years old, right after his father's murder. And then he self-medicated for most of his young life. His brother David, his brother Michael, their whole clique was very involved in drugs. It was the 60s after all. A lot of experimentation was going on. And I recently did a podcast series. It's a book club about RFK Jr.'s life. And I encourage people to listen to it if you don't know much about his life, because it's incredible. There's a book that was written by Jerry Oppenheimer 10 years ago called Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream. And I recommend it. If you'd like, you can listen to the book club. It's on my YouTube channel. Just look under the playlist tab and you'll find it. But we do a reading and discussion of some parts from his book that people should be aware of. And when you listen to my series or read the book, The Dark Side of RFK Jr., you'll see how the impact that losing his father had on him drove him over the edge. It drove him into a deep funk, a deep alcohol, drug, and sex addiction and bad behaviors. And this happened to so many of his siblings because Ethel was just not prepared as a widow to raise those 11 children by herself. She wasn't a hands-on mother. She didn't, raise them right, as they say. And so they
So,
went in terrible
sorry. I
directions.
mean, so she had like a mental breakdown or something like that, right?
Ethel,
Ethel, yeah.
I will say Ethel just passed away last October at the age of, what was she, 96, I think? It's amazing how strong she was. Ethel Kennedy
Mm.
was one tough cookie. We all marvel at how Jackie Kennedy was so composed and strong after the murder of JFK. But also I think Ethel deserves a lot of credit for her strength. Even at the worst of times, she was kind of the rock of the family. She was the glue that
Oh.
held everything together. And she had this amazing ability to kind of put on a happy face for the benefit of her kids after that
Mm.
assassination. She tried to stay upbeat. She tried to keep things fun around Hickory Hill and tried to make those kids feel somehow that things were normal, even though everybody knew they weren't. All I can say for Ethel is she tried, and she was incredibly strong. She had the backbone of a horse. Amazingly strong woman. And there's an interesting dynamic here that we should talk about. Ethel Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. always had a
Mm.
fraught relationship, even before Bobby, his father, was killed. Of all of her sons, all of her kids, Bobby was always the one that gave her the most trouble by her own account. And Bobby, of course, when he got into his rebellious teenage years and was sometimes running away from home and hitchhiking across the country on a stoner road trip, for weeks or months at a time, he and his mother were very distant. She kicked him out of the house. I don't know how many times. She disowned him completely, cut him off from his inheritances. I'm told that when she died last October, that she cut him out of her will. She was furious with him from the time he was a little boy. I don't know why, but sometimes it's like that in families. Sometimes there's one kid that mama just doesn't like. And in this family, unfortunately, it was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. His mama didn't love him enough, didn't hug him enough, didn't kiss him enough, didn't give him the kind of attention he needed. She would literally take this child and beat him with a hairbrush when he displeased her. Ethel had for all of her good qualities, she also had a very violent side. And this comes from numerous accounts of people who were at the receiving end of her violence over the years. But of all of her kids, Bobby seemed to take the brunt of it. He took a lot of beatings from his mom, literally with a hairbrush. And being kicked out of the house, being disowned. And he, at a very young age, learned to support himself. He ran away from home and took odd jobs doing anything, shoveling shit, just to get away from his mother. So that wound, although they tried later in life, it wasn't until Bobby was in his 60s and his mother was getting into her 90s that he tried to patch things up with her. Just over the past decade or so, it seemed like those two were starting to get close again, if not close, at least not hating each other. But then that all went to hell when he decided to run for president in 2023, because that was the one thing that Ethel begged him never to do. All his life he had been asked to run for president. There were always these expectations on Bobby Jr. to pick up the torch, to carry forward that mantle. And most of his life he avoided it. He never ran for any political office, never served in government until 2023. And when he announced his campaign, that was the last straw for his mother, Ethel. She lived in fear, of course, that he too would be assassinated. like his father. She didn't want to lose him that way. She did everything she could to talk him out of it, but it didn't work. He did it anyway. And then it made it worse that he was challenging Joe Biden, President Biden, who had been a longtime friend of Ethel's, very good friends with Ethel and all of the Kennedys, and of course the Democratic sitting president, and the Kennedys are diehard Democrats to the core. For Bobby to challenge Joe Biden really pissed Ethel and all of her other children off. As you well know, there was a big split in the Kennedy family during last year's presidential race. All of his siblings were against him. His own mother was against him. And as this race went on and things became very tense once the war in the Middle East broke out after October the 7th, I think that all of this unfortunately hastened Ethel's declining health and eventually her demise. You know, she died just couple of weeks before the presidential election. But when she died, she was aware that her son Bobby had endorsed Donald Trump, which to her was the unthinkable that he had done this. And I think it broke her heart. I think the woman honestly died of a broken heart. Reportedly, that is when she cut Bobby out of her will. And I don't think that he was allowed to even see her when she was on her deathbed. He didn't even travel there until after she died. And then, of course, he came to the funeral. But he wasn't allowed to speak at the funeral or give a eulogy. And in most of the family photos from that gathering, he's in the back. He's pushed to the back. So he's unfortunately made enemies out of his own family members.
Okay. So to cover more topics in the short time we have, can you talk a little bit about JFK Jr.? Because I was very fascinated with him, and I thought he was going to be the next president. So what was he like? What happened to him?
You just hit me in the heart there. I actually knew JFK Jr.
Really?
I did. I can't claim to know him really, really well, but I did know him for 8 years. And it's a long story. I actually have a video posted about it on my channel if anyone's interested, telling the long story of our friendship. But he was, how do I describe him? The most normal Kennedy I've ever met. Because most of them are just not normal. I'm not going to lie. A lot of them have deep, deep mental issues. But John somehow, in spite of it all, turned out pretty damn normal. John, like we were talking earlier about how Jackie raised her kids, John and Caroline too, you know, they both turned out to be pretty normal people. John was that guy that had the whole world's eyes on him from the time of his 3rd birthday when he famously gave that salute to his father's casket at his father's funeral. Can you imagine growing up, John F. Kennedy Jr., when from the time you're 10 years old, you're being groomed for the presidency? Everyone expects you to wear the crown, to be the prince, to carry that legacy on. And as he matured, it was so fascinating to watch him grow into adulthood, to see not only how handsome he was, you know, People magazine voted him the sexiest man alive many times, put him on the cover. All the girls of my generation were just in love with him. And he's one beautiful specimen of manhood, right, girls? But there was so much more to him than that. He was no great intellectual, but he was incredibly smart, very savvy. He had a vision. You know, he started a magazine in 1995, a political magazine called George. And I loved George magazine. It was way ahead of its time. George.
So that was named after George Washington, obviously.
Yeah. And that first cover, if you've ever seen the first cover of George, was Cindy Crawford, you know, the big supermodel of the time, dressed up as George Washington on the cover. George was really cool, and I wish that there was a online archive of all the old issues, but there isn't. I think it's a travesty that no one in all these years has uploaded every single article and every single issue of George to the internet. So if you want to
Mm.
read George, you literally have to buy old paper copies on eBay or something. And they're worth it. And they're worth a lot of money these days. So be prepared to pay a lot if you want them. But I loved George magazine because it was something that had never been done before in political news or reporting. This is before the internet. And I think he foresaw the internet coming. I think he saw the future coming. You know, the internet was just starting to come online in 1995, but not many people had it. And that's the year he launched this magazine. And so it was like a marriage of celebrity, pop culture, and politics, which for the first time made politics interesting to my generation. I'm a Gen X kid. We were a very skeptical generation. Our first memories are of the collapse of the Vietnam War, the withdrawal from Saigon, Watergate, the Rockefeller and Church committees, the JFK conspiracy. You know, we grew up at a time when nobody in my generation trusted the government. And
Mm.
we looked at politics as an ick. You know, we wanted nothing to do with politics. We thought the whole business was just disgusting. And John, because he was one of our cultural heroes, George magazine was a way of getting us interested in politics again, of kind of making it cool. And it worked, right? Now we see a
Mm.
lot of Gen Xers are into politics, and a lot of them are serving in the cabinet of President Trump right now. You see a lot of them, you know, we look at the demographics from the last election, and Gen X overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. I can't really explain why that is. Can you? SL, you got any
Mm.
ideas on that?
Mm. Well, I think it's partly because of social media that that's able to condense the political thoughts into few seconds, so makes it more palatable.
Oh, I see you just posted a picture of the launch of George magazine up there in the nest. I love that. I'll never forget
Yeah.
that day, the day that JFK unveiled George magazine. And you know, it's interesting because I was a journalist at that time, and many in the publishing world, especially, you know, the upper echelons, the Washington Post, the New York Times, all the stodgy old political publications sneered at, you know, they sniffed down their noses at George. They said, harump. Who wants a pop culture political magazine? That's beneath us. We are the, you know, we are the chosen ones. We are the smart ones. We're the ones who went to the best schools. And what John was saying with that magazine is that's why you're all wrong. That's why young people aren't interested in politics. Nobody reads The Economist. Okay.
Mm.
Kids in their 20s are not going to be reading Newsweek and The Economist. Boring. That stodgy old attitude, that elitist attitude is everything that's wrong with politics. So he wanted to make it more user friendly, shall we say, to young people, to make it more
Mm.
interesting. And it worked. And I can only imagine the things that John would have done had he lived.
Yeah, I mean, do you think if he had not died, or like maybe he was killed? So, well, if it were not for his death, do you think he would have become at least the senator from New York?
You know, I'm glad you asked about that. It's an interesting story, and it's another one of those things that the internet gets wrong a lot. You often see people on the internet say, oh, well, John was killed because he was running against Hillary Clinton for that Senate seat in New York. And that's just not true, guys. John F. Kennedy Jr. never ran for any political office. He never
Really?
sought, no, no. He
Hmm.
never sought, never announced that he was running for that Senate seat. He was, I will tell you this, his friends, people on the inside that were close to him said that he was at that time around 1999 when Daniel Patrick Moynihan was leaving that Senate seat. He for a moment kind of thought about it, but he was so committed to George magazine. That was his love. That was his dream. He was at the office every day working 16-hour days on the magazine. He was fully and
Hmm.
completely devoted to George magazine. And so he, I think he kind of thought about it for a minute and quickly decided, no, politics isn't for me, not yet. I really don't want to. And a lot of people in New York politics, of course, were asking him to run for that seat. But then First Lady Hillary Clinton, who was still First Lady at the time, made it clear that she had her eyes on that Senate seat, that she wanted it. And there's a thing in politics. If your friend is running for a seat, you don't run against your friend. And the fact of the matter is, the Clintons and the Kennedys, the John F. Kennedys, were very close. Jackie Kennedy and Hillary and Bill, they were very close. There were many visits to the White House, a lot of phone calls, back and forth. Their families were deeply intertwined. And John was not going to challenge his friend, Hillary Clinton. So that was for a fleeting moment that he thought about running for that seat. But the fact is he never did. And I don't know if his death was the result of pilot error, a case of spatial disorientation, which is very common even among experienced pilots when you're flying out over the Atlantic Ocean in the dark at night, which he was, without instruments. He was flying by sight. It's very easy to lose your frame of reference out there, to lose the horizon. And that's what the NTSB concluded, of course, that it was just a tragic case of spatial disorientation that caused his plane to crash. And I don't know. There's certainly some evidence that points at perhaps some kind of sabotage of that flight. But let's just say that there was. Let's assume that there was. Who would have a bigger motive to get rid of JFK Jr.? Well, not the Clintons. I'm sorry. I don't like the Clintons either. I can't stand them. But in this case, I don't think they had anything to do with his death because they were in fact friends. He posed no threat whatsoever to Bill and Hillary, and he would have gone out there and campaigned for Hillary. Had he lived, he would have been on the campaign trail helping her win that Senate seat. That's the political reality of the situation. If anyone had the motive to want to get rid of him, get him out of the way, my eye would be looking at George W. Bush, who was running for president at that very time. And do you know where George Bush was? This is an interesting fact. On the weekend of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane crash, July 16th, 1999, you'll never believe, well, maybe you will, where George W. Bush, presidential candidate, was that weekend. He was at the Bohemian Grove. Do you know what the Bohemian Grove is?
Yeah.
That elite club up in Northern California.
Yeah.
They go there the Ides of July, the 15th, 16th, 17th, usually around that time in July every year. And I checked his schedule, and that's where he was. He took the weekend off from the campaign trail and went out to relax at the Bohemian Club with his elite friends that weekend. Interesting.